and welcome to part 3 of my review of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. What is Rowling trying to say here? Reality is all in our heads? No, because there is a clear difference between the train station and the woods. Harry here is having some kind of spiritual experience in his head, but real at the same time. You're in my head. This review is in my head. But they're perfectly real. There is something after death, completely disproving what that time critic says, that Rowling is trying to kill God. Regardless of what religion you believe in, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Mormonism, spirituality cannot exist apart from God. Even religions that believe everyone is God have some kind of God view. Again, this time critic is an idiot. After this scene, Harry wakes up and is carried back to Hogwarts, where Neville, a true Gryffindor, is finally rewarded for his consistent efforts and pulls the sword from the Sorting Hat, killing Nagini, the final Horcrux. In my mind, there is no better person in all the Potter novels to perform this feat. Neville deserves redemption, and he receives it. Then, in a climactic battle in the Great Hall that has been heavily criticized for not having enough action and too much dialogue, Harry defeats Voldemort. But not before Mrs. Weasley has had a chance to shout the now famous line, "Not my daughter, you bitch!" Now, let me address people's concerns about the dialogue at the end of the novel. It's true, Rowling may have found a better way to tell us this information rather than Voldemort and Harry debating all this Deathly Hallows stuff at the last minute, but I, for one, relished the conversation. We finally see these two titans get to talk. Harry and Voldemort, the two most legendary wizards of all time. A simple battle would have been boring and predictable. That they actually exchange words rather than simply having another priori incantatem, as in the fourth novel, was a brilliant choice by Rowling, and thankfully reduced the after-explanation syndrome. You know how in some novels nobody explains anything before the climax, and then afterwards there's always this scene where everyone is sitting together and asking each other how this or that happened? And isn't it usually annoying? After the final Harry versus Voldemort battle, there are simply a few pages before the love it or hate it epilogue, which I'll get to later. There's no entire chapter where Harry simply sits with Ron and Hermione down and explains everything. And another thing that was grand about this final exchange of words was that it showed how much Harry has grown since the first novel. Here he is, standing against the most feared wizard of all time, and he's speaking with booming confidence. He has grown up, he is an adult, and he's pulling no punches. Without this final scene, Harry would have no character arc. A scene where they're hopping around shouting spells at random would be a bore. Who wants to read a bunch of incantations when we can actually hear our hero truly speak to who he is and who his opponent is? I personally relished this scene. Before I move on to the epilogue, I'm going to mention a few deaths, or lack of deaths, first. Lupin and Tonks die, but we don't actually see them die. We just see that their bodies are lying on the ground. This is painful to read, but also a bit of a mistake on Rowling's part. Without actually seeing them die, as we did with Dobby, Fred, and Hedwig, the pain is lessened. Even though I absolutely loved Lupin as a character, I found his death rang a bit hollow. Perhaps if we had actually seen him die, it would have helped. That, and it seems that Rowling added these deaths at the last minute just to up the body count, as if she realized only a few characters had died and added some more for good measure. Which brings me to my other criticism. Either Harry, Hermione, or Ron should have died. At least Hagrid. The fact that none of the central characters die, or at least stay dead, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Hagrid, even Malfoy, is unfortunately too indicative of Rowling's cowardice in that area. A good writer must be willing to kill his characters off, and I think the book would have ended better with the funeral for Hermione or somebody. Don't get me wrong, I love these central characters, but there were too many close calls for none of them to die. Perhaps it sounds a bit sadistic, but I think it's actually more realistic, and it might have changed up the oft-complained about cheesiness factor of the epilogue. Yes, the epilogue. I've often read a review online that says, "I loved it, but the epilogue sucked," or "The book was awesome, but the epilogue was too cheesy." I even read one that claimed that Rowling simply added it as an excuse to not write any more Harry books, but this criticism should quickly be cast aside, because, in fact, Rowling wrote the epilogue years ago, before there was even a question of continuing Harry Potter, as she has said. And I, for one, hope she never returns to Harry's world. Too often, a less-than-skilled writer can keep on writing sequels because the series has become a crutch for them. If Rowling wrote another Potter book, she could easily expect to make millions of dollars, but to what end? Harry's story is done. One of the things that is so beautiful about this theory is how intricately woven together everything is. Rowling ties up every loose end, and it's a joy to finally see the whole picture come together. Another book would seem tacked on, pointless, a mere something to appease fans who are clamoring for more. Rowling needs to move on, as do her readers. In any case, the epilogue, I think, is the perfect ending. And yes, though we do see a bit of weakness in her naming characters, James, Lily, Albus Severus, come on. It is a delight to see the people we loved all grown up. Some have complained that we don't find out enough about our heroes 19 years later, but I say, why do we need to? The point of this epilogue is not to show that Harry is now an Auror, or that Ron works at the Ministry, or that Draco is the next Dark Lord. It's to show that a new generation is beginning, and as Harry says goodbye to young Albus on platform 9 3/4, Rowling says goodbye to that world and is telling us that we should too. She is firmly closing the book. As everyone who has read the book knows, the last 2 lines are, "The scar had not pained Harry for 19 years. All was well." What a perfect closing. I couldn't think of anything better. It reminds me of Tolkien's extended endings, of Dickens writing about how the grandkids of his protagonists are doing. The many years later epilogue is a long revered tradition in literature, and I think Rowling's employing it is not only wonderfully acceptable, but also extremely clever. The reason people complain about it is because it's a sharp and brutal reminder to us that the series we have loved for so long is finally over, and we must say goodbye to it. We can revisit them again and again, and with our children and our children's children, but never can we experience it for the first time. As Harry sends young Albus onto the Hogwarts Express, so we send our young ones into the literary fantasy wonderland of Harry Potter. I close the book with a grand feeling of, well, closure, as well as sadness. Rowling had written a wonderful story, a beautiful and intricate one, and no matter what she writes in the future, nothing will be as big or as great as Harry. The stuffy academics and critics can complain and nitpick all they want. Harry, like Frodo and Aslan, will last. Of that, I have no doubt. Thanks, Joe.